to our Eastern Woodland Indian site here at the Frontier Culture Museum. What we're showing you on this site is actually a fairly large region. We're looking at the cultural groups that lived between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean and from Canada to Florida. So that's a huge region, and there are hundreds of very diverse nations living within that region. They're diverse economically, socially, politically, and culturally. Some groups you might be familiar with include the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois in the Northeast, the Ojibwe in the Great Lakes region, the Shawnee in the Ohio River Valley, the Creek on the Gulf Coast region, and in Virginia, the Powhatan, or the groups roughly under Powhatan's paramount chiefdom along the coastline, and in our more local area, the Monacan. Now, with such a large region, you are going to see a large amount of differences, but there are some commonalities that we'll see. For instance, they get most of their food from farming and then hunting and gathering and fishing to supplement that, growing things like corn, beans, and squash. And then the size and shapes of the houses will vary throughout the region, but the materials tend to be fairly similar. This wigwam or roundhouse is constructed by placing posts in the ground. If you want to come see, these are saplings that are fire hardened at the end to help prevent rot. And then they are lashed together. Well, they're placed in post holes, obviously. And then they're lashed together to form this dome shape. The structure is then covered with cattails, and if you look a little bit closely, you can see all of the air pockets, the bottom, well, and actually those go all the way through the entire length of the plant. This makes for an extremely good insulation. And if we have this door covered and a fire going in here in the winter, this is the warmest house in the entire museum. If you want to think about all of the other houses that are heating with fireplaces, that heat goes right up the chimney, it stays in here and circulates around. Now, it's going to be pretty smoky most of the time, but if you notice the beds, and if you want to look a little bit closer at the bed quickly, this is our bed right here, and above that, it's not a bunk bed, this is a shelf. You're able to store food in that smoky area to help preserve it. That smoke also helps preserve the house. At the top of the roof, you'll typically find a smoke hole cover on these structures. Now, this isn't exactly a chimney. There's a lot of space throughout, lots of little nooks and crannies for smoke to get out. But in the summertime, they have fires going year round. If you open this using a large pole like this, and then use the door like a flue, that will help pull hot air up and out of the house. So the time period that we're talking about for this site is roughly 1650 to 1750. And we particularly chose that time period because we're not as interested in talking about the pre-contact life of the native peoples that live here in the Eastern Woodlands. Although we do talk about that some, especially when we're talking about their tools and technology. But we're more interested here at the museum in looking at the interactions that you're going to see between these human groups of people from these cultural groups from Europe and West Africa. Those folks are coming to this quote unquote new world, but it's not a new world for the people that are already living here. They've been living in these spaces for tens of thousands of years. They're shaping the environment just as much as they are shaped by the environment. And they're shaping each other through the transmission of technology and trade and ideas. Now, when you see that introduction of people from across the Atlantic into the New World, quote unquote New World, you are going to see a lot of change over a rapid period of time compared to what you'd seen prior to that. So those rapid changes tend to be in three arenas: the ecological change, epidemic change, and economic change. So the ecological changes, some of those are intended consequences with the introduction of new species of animals like chickens, pigs, cows, horses, cats, rats, sheep, pigs, goats. None of those were found in North America before Europeans arrived. You also will see some accidental and some intentional introductions of new plant species. For instance, not sure if you realize this, but those dandelions you might fuss about in your lawns were brought over purposely by Europeans as a food item, and then they escaped and naturalized. We'll see that still to this day. We have concern about non-native, or invasive species in communities. Now, another thing that we'll see introduced into this region are new diseases that didn't exist, primarily because those animals that transmit those diseases, say pigs transmitting influenza, didn't live here with the people for tens of thousands of years like they did in Europe and Africa and Asia. The last change that we'll see that shapes the region quite a bit too is economic, and that's primarily in the form of trade. Now, again, I mentioned earlier that native peoples are trading with each other for tens of thousands of years. That's because that's what humans do. If you've got a resource I don't have and I've got a resource you don't have, we might be trading that, or we're probably definitely going to be trading that. But when we see the introduction of new items from Europe, it's primarily in the form of new technology, and that does tend to change this area fairly quickly. Now, if we're looking at the natural resources that Eastern Woodland Indians are using before Europeans arrived, they have tools made out of stone, bone, wood, and shell. And these tools are sophisticated. They are not, we're not looking at things that don't work. It's always helpful to note that human beings are observant. So if you have an axe that isn't working, what are you going to do? You're going to fix it. Axes like this are very sophisticated, and they work really, really well. However, if you see something like this, that's a form of new technology brought over by Europeans, which one of these is going to work better? Answer really is, it kind of depends on how you use it. So if you don't know how to use an axe at all, neither one of them are going to work very well for you, but they work differently. This axe right here works really well with green wood. A tree that's cut down just recently is soft and easy to cut. But if you want to, say, shape hold on, I've got it here somewhere. If you want to shape a hard piece of wood like this mortar, you'll use fire to help you shape it. Burning the wood softens it, and you'll be able to do that work a little bit quicker. This axe, though, stays sharper for longer. So this is going to be something that you want. Now, what type of clothing are you wearing before European arrival? If you're an Eastern Woodland Indian, you're primarily wearing buckskin or deerskin. And we have a couple of other types of furs that would be used for different things, but this is primarily what you're wearing for clothing. Now, this takes a lot of work to produce and eventually becomes the valuable item that Europeans want to trade for. This right here becomes one of the most desired items for trade from Europeans to native peoples. They like cloth right away. They like iron tools right away. In fact, when we see the earliest European accounts of trade in the 1520s off of the coast of Maine, these people that are being introduced to a new culture have to come up with a way to describe that new culture. The two main descriptions for Europeans by natives basically translate to cloth makers or iron tool makers. Those are the two things that they want right away. They also tend to like things, just like all human beings do, that are just new and fancy. So if you've got something your friends don't have, whoa, it's like your new kicks, right? So if you're looking at these shell beads, versus glass beads, I mean, they work the same, right? They're necklaces. There's not really much difference, but this one's new, fancy. Your friends don't have it. It's going to make you a lot cooler. When we see this sort of trade, it's going to basically change the lifestyle you'll see in a lot of these groups. For instance, most of these societies are matrilineal societies, and the people who tend to have the most status in these societies are older people. If you're a hunter and you acquire a gun through trade from Europeans and can go out and suddenly hunt a lot more animals than you were previously able to, you're going to have a lot more status in your community. You might also, and this frequently happens, be armed by Europeans to capture other tribes. So when we're looking at the Indian slave trade, that's going to affect the region very, very quickly, even in places where someone is not in close proximity to a European settlement. So these major changes that you'll see, the environmental or ecological changes, the epidemic changes, and the economic changes or changes in status in society, make this become almost as much a new world for the people that are living here as it is for the people they're encountering. So how the frontier and how American frontier culture is defined historically and today is really linked to the interactions between European, African, and indigenous cultures. Whether or not these exchanges were violent or nonviolent, dependent or symbiotic, willing or unwilling, they ultimately shape how this story is told and how we understand it today. On this exhibit, we discuss historical contributions of these communities in the past, but it's worth mentioning that their contributions don't just exist in the past. These sovereign communities are still here, and they continue to impact the cultures of all of the Americas today. Thank you for joining us on our virtual tour of the Eastern Woodland Indian site. We hope to see you in person soon.